A warm sunset fell upon Redwood, a large coastal city on the west coast of the United States, an intersection of diverse cultures and cutting-edge technology. The last rays of daylight stretched golden-orange streaks across tall buildings, casting long shadows on the paved streets. Along Main Avenue leading into downtown, traffic remained heavy, signaling a bustling rush hour. Marcus Avery, a black man in his early 40s, tall and resolute, with a face marked by determination, was driving his silver-gray sedan home after a day's work at the Redwood Police Department. Dressed in a dark, well-fitted suit, his tie slightly loosened, he exuded a professional bearing tinged with fatigue. The name badge on his chest read, Marcus Avery, Head of Internal Affairs. He played soft jazz on the car radio, volume set low. He found solace in these classic tunes, especially after a long, high-pressure workday. Every now and then, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, an ingrained habit from years of training in attentiveness and detail. Outside, a cool ocean breeze slipped through the partially open window, carrying a mild, salty scent. The day's tensions flashed through Marcus's mind. The heated meeting about rising complaints against the police, various allegations of power abuse. He was preparing to discuss major reforms with Captain Harriet Townsend, the head of the Redwood Police Department. Yet he knew well that pushing through reforms would not be easy, especially amidst internal resistance. At the next traffic light, he slowed down as it shifted from green to yellow, then eased to a stop on red. The phone call he'd made earlier to his wife replayed in his mind. "I'll try to get home early, Sophia. I want to have dinner with you and our son." The traffic light stayed red. Right then, a blaring police siren and flashing red and blue lights interrupted the evening's tranquility. Marcus frowned, checking his rearview mirror. A patrol car had just activated its emergency lights, racing up behind him. He pulled over, heart beating a little faster. Not out of fear, but from surprise. He'd fully stopped at the red light, so he was puzzled about why he was being pulled over. Lowering his window, he waited. Stepping out of the patrol car was Officer Paul Lancaster, around his early 30s with a military-style haircut and a robust build. Lancaster exuded decisiveness as he adjusted his utility belt before approaching Marcus's car. His face was expressionless, but there was an undercurrent of intimidation. "License and registration," Lancaster said curtly, without so much as a greeting. Marcus complied calmly. "Here you go, officer." Lancaster took the documents, casting a scrutinizing gaze as though searching for something amiss. "You know why I pulled you over?" Marcus shook his head slightly. "I'm not sure." "I came to a full stop when the light turned red." Lancaster narrowed his eyes. "Not fast enough. You almost ran it." Marcus furrowed his brow, but didn't argue. "I see." They locked eyes for a few seconds. The air suddenly felt dense, as though brimming with prejudice and power. Lancaster slipped Marcus's documents into his shirt pocket. "Step out of the car," he ordered tersely. Marcus hesitated. "Officer, is there a reason why I need to get out?" Lancaster's cold gaze remained fixed. "Get outside. Don't make me repeat myself." Marcus studied Lancaster's demeanor. There was an unmistakable hostility. He understood that arguing would only escalate tensions. He opened the door and stepped out. An evening breeze swirled past, sending a small shiver through Marcus, and not just from the chill. He sensed what might happen next. Lancaster moved back a step, eyeing Marcus head to toe. Dark suit, polished dress shoes, a poised demeanor, qualities that should signal a respectable professional. Yet Lancaster's gaze seemed bent on finding wrongdoing. "Where are you rushing to at this hour?" Lancaster asked, resting a hand near his holster. "I'm heading home," Marcus responded quietly. "Home? You new to Redwood?" There was a tense edge to Lancaster's voice. Marcus suspected the officer had already sized him up, perhaps because of his skin color or something else he deemed suspicious. "I moved here about 6 months ago," Marcus confirmed. "My new address is on my license." Lancaster let out a disdainful grunt. There was clearly a preconceived bias. Marcus, unfortunately, had seen it all too often. A certain look in an officer's eyes when they size him up by race. "Turn around, hands on the hood," Lancaster said curtly. "I need to check for weapons or contraband." Marcus knew full well how unjustified the request was. This was hardly the standard response to a supposed red light violation. Yet from experience, he chose not to escalate the situation and complied. He slowly turned around and placed both palms on the hood, inhaling deeply to steady himself. Lancaster conducted a rough pat-down that felt more like intimidation than a genuine search. Anger simmered in Marcus, but he kept it in check. As the head of internal affairs, he was deeply aware of how vital it was to remain composed, especially in such a volatile encounter. "There's nothing," Lancaster finally mumbled, sounding almost disappointed as he stepped back. Marcus turned to face him, calm but with a clear sense of indignation. "I told you, I'm just heading home." "Don't think you can fool me with your so-called knowledge of the law," Lancaster snapped. "People like you always act like you're above us." The phrase hung in the tense air like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus felt his heart tighten. "People like you." Those words carried the weight of prejudice. "What did you just say?" Marcus asked in a low, deliberate tone, eyes fixed on Lancaster. Lancaster hesitated, then reflexively moved a hand closer to his gun. "You heard me. You know exactly what I mean." Marcus's eyes narrowed. Though he'd faced similar discrimination before, it still struck a nerve. "Yes. And I think we both know this has nothing to do with running a red light anymore." Lancaster started to retort but fell silent, realizing he had crossed a line. In that still moment, Lancaster's aggression briefly faltered, confronted by Marcus's calm, piercing composure. The air grew still. The last rays of the sunset dimmed, paving the way for dusk. Far-off cars honked. The breeze hissed among the tall buildings, sounds fading into the background as the two men faced each other by the roadside. Marcus moved a hand slowly toward his inner jacket pocket. "I'm reaching for my wallet," he said, voice steady. "No aggression intended. I just want you to see something." Lancaster glared suspiciously, his hand still poised near his holster, but he didn't stop Marcus. Marcus took out a leather wallet, opened it to reveal a badge and an ID card. "Marcus Avery, Head of Internal Affairs, Redwood Police Department." Lancaster's eyes widened. He stared from the ID to Marcus's face and back again, his own face gradually growing pale. Internal Affairs?" he stammered. Marcus gave a firm nod, meeting Lancaster's gaze. "I oversee and investigate officer misconduct." A jolt of shock gripped Lancaster. He stepped back slightly, as though his duty belt had become unbearably heavy. Marcus's voice remained calm, but carried a quiet disappointment. "You see, officer, the saddest part isn't that you pulled me over for no legitimate reason. It's your assumptions. Assuming I wouldn't know my rights, that I'd be easy to bully, or that I somehow looked suspicious because of how I appear. That's what I can't ignore." Lancaster was silent, head dipped in shame and alarm. He realized the magnitude of this moment. His entire career could be at stake. "Return my documents," Marcus said, "and think carefully about what you say next. I'm not just another driver you stopped. I'll be seeing you again in my capacity as the person who decides whether you stay in this department." Lancaster's lips parted in a feeble attempt at defense, but no words emerged. Finally, hands trembling, he pulled Marcus's license and registration from his pocket and handed them over. Marcus slid them back into his wallet and re-entered his sedan. Before shutting the door, he looked back at Lancaster. "The badge on your chest doesn't make you superior to the public. It gives you the duty to protect and respect every citizen." With that, Marcus started the engine and drove away into the growing darkness, leaving Lancaster behind in the flickering red and blue lights, stunned and uncertain. Night had fully settled. Marcus's sedan glided through now quieter streets. Inside the car, the silence was thick enough that he could almost hear his own heartbeat. The memory of Lancaster's hateful glare flashed through his mind. Then that same gaze replaced by shock and fear. This wasn't Marcus's first brush with racial bias. Growing up in a troubled neighborhood in the Southeast, he'd witnessed far too many routine stops where young black men were presumed guilty. In his 20s, he too had been stopped without cause. That ordeal solidified his resolve to join the police force, hoping to effect change from within. He'd climbed the ranks with resilience, eventually becoming head of internal affairs. Marcus was well aware of his enormous responsibility, leading the crucial mission of investigating misconduct and transforming a long-standing culture. Yet he firmly believed in justice and felt compelled to ensure no one endured unwarranted fear simply because of their skin color or background. Pulling into his driveway, he saw the living room light still on. Entering, he found his wife, Sophia, at the dinner table with their 10-year-old son, Ethan. "You're home late," Sophia said softly. She noticed the strain in Marcus's eyes. "Is everything all right?" He mustered a weary smile, kissing his wife on the forehead and gently patting his son's shoulder. "Yes, just need a shower and some rest." Dinner passed quietly. Marcus chose not to burden them with the details, though the unresolved tension and future consequences weighed on him. Next morning, Redwood was chilly, the coastal breeze creeping through the streets. Marcus arrived at his office earlier than usual. The Redwood Police Department occupied a massive concrete building crowned by a large sign proclaiming, "Serve and Protect." Officers bustled in and out. Clerks hurried along with files and coffee cups. On the third floor, Internal Affairs, his administrative assistant, Jenny Adams, was stacking fresh reports. "Morning, Mr. Avery. I emailed you a summary of new complaints. Also a reminder of your afternoon meeting with Captain Townsend." Marcus nodded in thanks, taking the stack. On top was a slim file labeled Paul Lancaster, with a note about multiple allegations of abuse of authority. "Jenny, please prepare a detailed breakdown of all complaints against Lancaster," he requested. "I'm afraid I'll have to address him soon." Jenny nodded. "Sure thing. I'll get right on it." Marcus hung up his coat and sat behind his desk, opening the file on Lancaster. Multiple community complaints, unjustified stops, harassment, disrespect, none formally proven severe enough to dismiss him, partly because victims often feared speaking out. This was just the tip of an iceberg. Lancaster, Marcus realized, symbolized a deeper flaw in department culture. That afternoon, Marcus headed to a conference room at the end of the second-floor corridor. Harsh, fluorescent lights shone on a large wooden table in the center, with police awards and motivational posters adorning the walls. A national flag and state flag stood in a corner, swaying lightly in the AC's breeze. Captain Harriet Townsend, a career officer in her early 50s with gray-streaked hair neatly tied back, waited inside. Her sharp gaze conveyed authority and experience. Several mid-level leaders from relevant departments were also present. "Good afternoon," Avery Townsend said in a low, serious tone. "I hear you have something urgent to discuss." Marcus took a seat across from her, getting straight to the point. "Captain, last night I experienced firsthand the kind of prejudice and abuse of authority we've been seeing complaints about. The officer in question is Paul Lancaster." Others in the room exchanged glances. Neil Foster, the head of the patrol division, cleared his throat. "I've heard a few grumbles about Lancaster, but nothing too serious. He generally does his job." Marcus set the file on the table, his voice tightening. "He has quite a few complaints against him, none formally resolved. Citizens often don't pursue cases because they're scared, but I just encountered how Lancaster conducts himself. Prejudice was blatant, and we can't ignore it." Captain Townsend listened intently, her features taut with concern. "What do you propose?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I want a full investigation of Lancaster, and beyond that, a thorough review of how we train, supervise, and hold every officer accountable. We've been patching over issues. It's time for meaningful reform. I believe we owe it to the community." A moment of tension settled in. Foster exchanged uneasy looks with other leaders. Some seemed anxious over the potential backlash. "You realize," Townsend said quietly, "this might provoke strong resistance within the department?" "I do," Marcus replied firmly. "But if we don't act, public trust in us will keep eroding. I believe you don't want that either." Townsend nodded, her resolve hardening. "I support you, but I'll need a concrete plan. I'll notify higher-ups. If approved, we'll move quickly." Marcus exhaled in relief. "Thank you, Captain. I'll start drafting right away." When the meeting ended, the others filed out, leaving Marcus alone to glance at the framed medals and motivational slogans on the walls. Words like integrity, service, honor. He murmured under his breath, "Time to turn these words into real action." Marcus and his internal affairs team spent weeks collecting data, meeting stakeholders, and organizing a series of listening forums at community centers around Redwood. His assistant Jenny scheduled these events and kept track of the mounting feedback. At one such forum, an elderly woman named Rosa Velasquez recounted how her son had been stopped late at night, just for wearing a hoodie while riding his bike home from work. Her voice wavered with tears. "I respect the police, but I beg that they respect us too. My son isn't a criminal. He was just coming home from his shift at the grocery store." Others shared similarly troubling accounts, all hinting at unspoken biases. Marcus patiently took notes, promising to pursue each case. Standing off to the side was a young black man, Jamal, around 20. Reluctant to speak publicly, he admitted to Marcus that Lancaster had once singled him out for questioning after Jamal accidentally wandered into a wealthy neighborhood. Fearful of retaliation, he hadn't dared to file a complaint. Marcus gripped Jamal's hand reassuringly. "Trust me. We'll follow through. You can file confidentially or anonymously. Our job is to protect you." Jamal nodded, relief softening his features. Hearing these stories only fueled Marcus's resolve to push forward, no matter how steep the path. Meanwhile, backlash simmered inside the department. Some veteran officers grumbled that the cleanup campaign, tarnished the department's reputation. Others, particularly younger recruits, quietly supported Marcus, but feared speaking out, wary of being ostracized. Paul Lancaster, since that fateful traffic stop with Marcus, had been placed on suspension pending investigation. His days were spent in a haze of anger, guilt, and worry. One evening, Marcus prepared to head home late from the office. Lancaster suddenly appeared at the door, looking visibly strained. "Mr. Avery," Lancaster said hoarsely, I'd like a moment with you." "Privately." Marcus paused, noting Lancaster's uneasy demeanor. He gestured for him to come in. Jenny hovered, concerned, but Marcus assured her it was all right. Lancaster stood in the middle of the office, hands clenched. I know it's probably too late, but I don't want my career to end. Marcus folded his arms, waiting. Lancaster cleared his throat and blurted, "I'm not racist. It's just, I've been under so much pressure. My father was a cop who told me never to let my guard down, always be wary of suspects. I grew up in a tough neighborhood full of gangs, so I took that mindset into my job." Marcus interrupted, quietly but firmly. "I hear you, but that doesn't justify your behavior. Pressure and background aren't excuses to violate citizens' rights." Lancaster cast his eyes downward, voice trembling. "I just want a chance to make it right." Marcus held Lancaster's gaze, his tone stern, yet there was a hint of empathy. "Whether you get that chance depends on the investigation's findings and your genuine efforts to change. People can change, but you have to prove it with actions, not just words." Lancaster nodded, shoulders slumping. "Thank you for hearing me out." He left the room, and Marcus sat alone in the late-night quiet, contemplating. Maybe he deserves a second chance if he truly wants it, Marcus thought. But first, the formal process had to run its course. A few days later, the Redwood Police Department convened an internal disciplinary hearing for Paul Lancaster. A 5-member panel presided, with Marcus a key participant. A modest audience looked on, including some local reporters. The case had drawn public interest. Lancaster sat at the center table, sweating, supported by a department-appointed attorney. Next to him was Ken Matthews, a fellow officer who was also a friend, watching anxiously. The proceedings involved a methodical review of evidence, complaint records, citizen statements, footage from Lancaster's body camera and dash cam. Several clips showed him acting aggressively during traffic stops, hurling disparaging remarks. Lancaster sat grim-faced as the attorney argued he'd been overburdened by job stress in dangerous environments. Finally, Lancaster spoke in his own defense. "I admit my mistakes, and I apologize for letting my biases interfere with my duty. I promise to do better if I'm given another chance." He glanced at Marcus, hoping for leniency. After deliberation, the panel handed down a 6-month suspension without pay and mandated Lancaster undergo cultural and ethics retraining. Any repeat offense, and he would be dismissed. Public reactions were mixed. Some claimed the punishment was too lenient, others too harsh. Marcus believed it struck a necessary balance, accountability and a path for an offender to reform. It was a single instance of discipline within a larger push for systemic change. After the hearing, Captain Townsend officially authorized the sweeping reforms Marcus had proposed. A dedicated reform task force was established, including internal affairs personnel, community representatives, and some younger officers eager to improve policing. The changes ranged widely. Clear, detailed behavioral guidelines emphasizing human rights and respect, mandatory training in psychology, cultural conflict resolution, and communication skills. Independent oversight ensuring body cams were active, with regular data reviews. Easier, more confidential reporting for citizens filing complaints. Serious disciplinary measures. No more hiding or deflecting misconduct. Marcus and his team organized internal workshops and brought in experts in psychology, criminology, and civil rights. They also joined forces with nonprofits to set up hotlines where victims could safely report police misconduct. Little by little, the reforms began taking shape. Some officers, set in their old ways, grumbled. Others, especially newer recruits, welcomed the chance to prove themselves as a more community-centered force. About 3 months later, as the reforms gained momentum, Marcus heard that Paul Lancaster had completed his mandatory retraining. During his suspension, he'd volunteered in underserved neighborhoods, places he once patrolled with a suspicious eye. One afternoon, Lancaster asked Marcus to meet him at a small cafe near the police station. Although surprised, Marcus accepted. At the cafe, Lancaster sat hunched over a steaming cup of coffee, his hands clasped anxiously. Marcus arrived and greeted him with a polite nod. The atmosphere felt heavy with old tensions. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked. Lancaster nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I just wanted to thank you, Avery, for giving me a second chance. I know I messed up, but these past few months I've learned a different perspective. I talked with people in neighborhoods I once looked down on." He paused, inhaling. "I'm not saying I'm suddenly perfect, but now I understand why many don't trust the police, and how my actions contributed to that distrust." Marcus listened intently, sensing sincerity in Lancaster's remorse. "I appreciate your honesty. When I return to duty," Lancaster continued, "I'd like to be part of the change you're creating, if you'll let me." Marcus placed a hand on Lancaster's shoulder. "We can use every ally we can get. Your intentions are good, but you must prove it day by day." Lancaster tried a tentative smile. "I will." They left the cafe in an odd mix of solemnity and hope. True, old prejudices don't vanish overnight, but a door to redemption had cracked open. A few months later, on the cusp of the new year, Redwood buzzed with festivities. Preliminary results from the department's changes were encouraging. Fewer complaints, improved accountability, and a new training curriculum. The police leadership organized a community conference titled Building Trust and Justice. They invited Marcus Avery as the keynote speaker to share his experiences and vision. The city's cultural center was packed with officers, city officials, and local residents, along with media representatives. A lively excitement pervaded the room. Would the reforms truly last? Marcus walked onto the stage in a crisp white shirt, a blue tie, and a neatly pressed suit jacket. Standing at the podium, he surveyed the crowd. Up front, he spotted Sophia and Ethan, beaming with pride. Off to one side, he noticed Lancaster, looking calm and engaged, seated with fellow officers. Nearby stood Captain Townsend, quietly nodding encouragement. Marcus spoke, his voice clear and resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Redwood Police Department has embarked on a journey of reform. It hasn't been easy. We face skepticism, pushback, both within and outside our ranks. But we believe this is the only way to rebuild community trust." He paused, drawing a breath before continuing. "Justice isn't just about apprehending criminals. It's about safeguarding the dignity of every citizen, regardless of race, background, or wealth. Wearing this badge doesn't grant us a free pass. It's a pledge to serve. When someone in our ranks violates that pledge, we must confront it, fix it, and ensure it doesn't happen again." Applause erupted. Marcus felt a wave of emotion, but stayed composed. This is only the beginning. We still have much to do, strengthening oversight, refining policies, and expanding training programs. Most importantly, we'll keep listening to you, the people of Redwood. When we unite, we can create a police force worthy of respect, so that no one has to fear the flash of blue and red lights in their rearview mirror. Thunderous clapping filled the auditorium. Marcus caught sight of Sophia, glowing with pride, and recognized the faint yet genuine smile on Lancaster's face. Relief, perhaps acceptance. He also saw Captain Townsend nod, signaling strong support. After the event, attendees swarmed around Marcus, offering congratulations and questions. Eventually, Rosa Velasquez reached him, voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Avery. Thanks to your team's efforts, my son finally felt safe enough to file a complaint about that incident, and it was resolved fairly. I'm hopeful Redwood will keep improving." Marcus smiled, shaking her hand. "It's a collective effort, ma'am. We'll keep working together." "Not far off," Lancaster observed, seemingly moved by the positive changes. His colleague Ken Matthews gave him a light nudge. "You were one of the biggest critics before all this. Thoughts now?" Lancaster shrugged sheepishly with a small grin. "I still have a lot to learn. But Avery's proven this is the right direction." Standing near the entrance, Marcus took a call from Linda Moore, a journalist at Redwood Times. She requested an in-depth interview about future plans. He looked at the twilight sky, the pinkish hue of dusk gently illuminating Redwood's skyline. Hanging up, Marcus felt a surge of optimism. The road to meaningful reform would surely remain rocky. There would be more Officer Lancasters, more issues and barriers to overcome. Still, he sensed that every genuine convert to justice could spread hope, and hope, once it takes root, paves the way for lasting fairness. He recalled the promise he'd made to Sophia and Ethan. "I'll help make the police a true ally to the community." And that night, he felt one step closer to fulfilling that promise. Late that evening, Marcus returned home, a calm satisfaction hovering around him. He shared highlights of the conference with Sophia and Ethan over a simple meal beneath the warm glow of the dining room lamp. 10-year-old Ethan looked up at him with awe. "Dad, you're like a real-life hero." Marcus chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Nobody's a hero alone. I'm just lighting the spark, but it takes everyone to keep the flame burning. Together, we can make a difference." That night, Marcus stepped out onto the balcony, gazing at Redwood's sparkling city lights. He thought back on his personal journey, from a black kid who once feared the police to heading internal affairs with a mission to break the cycle of mistrust. For good. He knew the fight was far from over. Tomorrow might bring new obstacles, maybe another Officer Lancaster. But tonight, he felt a quiet certainty that each victory, no matter how small, was lighting a path for bigger change. If this story resonates with you, share it. Talk to those around you about prejudice, about owning our faults, and most importantly, about working together for a fairer system. Because the biggest transformations often begin with seemingly small roadside encounters.